And I hope what we discussed this morning will encourage you and benefit you and grow some of the spirituality that I know already exists here at Skyway Hills. And by looking at that sermon title, you might think, sounds like a real hellfire and brimstone sermon coming, but it's nothing like that. Above or below it means something different in this particular context today. Actually, what I want to do is continue where I left off in my last lesson about accountability to God, and I hope to just build on that lesson a little bit more today. So today I want you to think about these three things. First, I want you to think about what maybe is one of the most dangerous barriers in terms of a group working in unity, an organization that has to work together. What is one of the most significant and dangerous barriers to that unity happening? What's the hardest part of our bodies to keep under control? What's the most sinful part of our bodies in our daily lives? Just keep those questions in mind as we go through the lesson, and at the end, we'll discuss what that means. But before I get there, I want to do an update for the Magi Project. I want to do due diligence and keep you informed about where we're at. So we're making a good charge at it for 2018. We've already had one box turned in, and maybe more of you are ready to turn in boxes. I had originally scheduled for November 11th to be our collection day, our final collection day. But I'd like to move that up, if you don't mind. I want to save money this year in shipping costs and things like that, so I want to just physically carry it over to Fort Worth myself. And in order to accommodate that in my own personal schedule, I need to actually leave on that weekend of the 11th. So if we can get all the boxes together by the weekend of the 4th, that'll help us accomplish that. And again, these boxes will be going to Mexico this year. So we've included Spanish Bibles, and I made an appeal the last time about getting more of those Bibles, and we've had some generous donors help us do that. So now we have 2 cases of the paperback Spanish version of NIV Bibles ready to go. And again, what we do there is we just ship the Bibles in those boxes that they come in, and we ask them to distribute it to some of the local evangelists and let them use it in their work. We don't try to stuff them in the boxes. We've done that in the past, but we wind up having to tie a rope and a bungee cord around that thing because it's bulging so bad. So this makes it just a little easier to get everything in those boxes that we want, and also ship these Bibles for the evangelist's use. I want to have a week or so of some what I call final preps. We've got some things left over from past Magi projects down there in the storeroom, and I want to break those out and let us use those to help complement whatever we might have in our boxes. So I want to do that around the end of October, as I mentioned there. I think that the 28th is a Sunday, the 31st is a Wednesday. And then I want to add all the final items to the boxes at that time, do kind of an inventory and make sure that we've tried to meet the goals for what goes into those boxes. And if we have gaps, that'll give us a little bit more time to finish things off at the very end there. So hopefully that helps explain where we're trying to go. And lastly, I want to give you this little mission update. Why do we do this thing? Why does the Magi Project? Remember, it stands for Making a Godly Impact. It's where we send these little boxes of gifts out to folks in remote areas of the world that never get a chance to enjoy even the simplest of gifts. So things that we consider throwaway items, they consider to be treasures. And it's a way to help the local church there get into the lives of those folks and help them, introduce them to the concept that there is a God and He does care. And because He cares, He produces people like this who are willing to reach out to total strangers and try to make each day a little bit brighter. So Beth, if you could bring up that link there or bring up the page. There's an article there. HHI sends out periodic updates. So I wanted you to be able to see that article and see an example here of Art. His name is Art Woods. And he was a recipient of a Magi box a long time ago. As you can see, he's no longer a little kid, and he's now studying the Word to become an evangelist, a preacher. And that's just one small example of what this project can do. Many years ago, somebody cared enough that he got a box, and it inspired him to change the direction of his life. And he's now wanting to pay it forward, to share what he's learned about Christ. Also, I'll show you there, they have a goal there. If you look to the right of the screen, there's a goal set out there of 30,000 boxes this year, and they show the inventory they received so far is 5,000 boxes. So just by way of giving you an update of how that ministry is going right now. Okay? So I want to start, as I said, by recapping where I left off last time about accountability. And if you recall, we went through a lot of different review of the Scriptures to show why accountability is so important and what God expects of each of us in terms of our accountability to Him. And then at the close, we asked ourselves, so why then, if we know all this, is it so hard to do? And we concluded that, well, maybe it's not so hard. Maybe it's us making it difficult by the way we approach the Word itself, accountability. So I reached out to a management principle out there that many of you might have seen in your travels through work. It's called the Oz Principle. And this is a book written by some folks on the concept of accountability. And they use the Wizard of Oz, the story of the Wizard of Oz, as a backdrop, as a meme for communicating the concept that they want to communicate about accountability. And I'll get more into that a little later. But I wanted to review these slides. These are repeats from my last lesson. And so their take on the word accountability is to make it a little less punitive, a little less like something where we're called on the carpet and made to feel guilty of something. And, I remember how I described when something goes wrong, what happens? Everybody scatters. Nobody wants to be accountable for this thing and explain why it happened, why things went wrong. And that's the opposite of what we want for accountability. So maybe if we approach it more as a personal choice where we rise above the circumstances that we're in and demonstrate that ownership, we'll begin to see accountability take hold in the way we do things on a day-by-day basis. So that was the concept behind changing the definition, or try to twist the definition a little bit to make it a little bit more positive. And then we reviewed different steps that we go through that leads to the results that we see here at church or anywhere in any organization. And it all begins with our experiences, what we experience out there in life. And what we experience begins to develop internally our belief system, what we believe. And then, based on those beliefs, we act. And then, based on those actions, we'll get a result. And sometimes the result can be disastrous, right? Sometimes the actions can be the null set. We don't do anything because of what we believe. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're in an organization where it's really frowned upon to bring up trouble. You're branded as a troublemaker or a constant pain in the rear, right? And so people begin to learn by their experiences that that's not a good thing, right? And so they tend to be quiet. And so their action is don't do anything because their belief system has told them that's not a good thing to do, to bring up problems that you see, to identify things, to try to show that, hey, we got a situation over here we need to change. Don't do that. And then the outcome can be quite disastrous because the problems, they may not be apparent at first, but over time, and I'll show you an example later, a very graphic example, they can become quite a disaster. Even though from the outside it looked like everything was fine. But because of this characteristic that existed in the organization, this belief system that it's wrong to bring up problems, no one did anything about it, and the result is catastrophe. So we also talked about children, how they learn things. They're always listening. And so sometimes we have our kids do things and we're just like, where did that come from? I never taught you that. You never heard me say that. Well, the reality is they did hear us say that, didn't they? They're always watching, they're always listening, they're always learning. And they always tend to apply it the wrong way, the way we don't want them to apply what they learned, right? And so that happens in life too, right? We learn at home, we learn at school, we learn at church. Well, this is the honorable, the integrity thing that you're supposed to follow in life. And when we get out there and start making it on our own out in the world, we learn, well, maybe there's a few things that don't work. Maybe there's some corners I need to cut. This is the way life really works. And we begin to change our beliefs. Even though we may have heard fantastic lessons, we may have studied everything in the Bible, we may have been through Bible class and heard these wonderful sermons, there's still that experience that we encountered that changes our belief system, and it changes the way we act. And so that's where I want to go today, is work on one aspect of those experiences that form those beliefs. And then finally, I gave you some recommendations about how we can own this concept of accountability. And this comes again from the Oz principle. Going back to the Oz principle, remember the whole principle was you had people who were going through their situation and they were complete victims of their circumstances, right? Everything they did, it was all about somebody else did this or somebody else did that, and everything was out of control, and the only answer for them was to what? Follow the yellow brick road that led to the wizard, right? The Wizard of Oz. He had all the answers. He was going to cure everything. And we talked about how at the end, it turned out he had nothing, right? He had nothing. He was just a guy. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Turned out that was the wizard. And he really had nothing to offer except some advice that, well, maybe you had it in yourselves the whole time. Remember that Frank Baum and others like him were writing books in that time of history where they were warning society. The federal government was becoming much more powerful, much stronger, much longer in its reach. And they were warning people, look, to become so dependent like that on somebody else for all the answers is a bad thing. It can lead to disastrous results. You need to take accountability for your own actions. And so books like The Wizard of Oz, books like Atlas Shrugged, books like 1984 were written to remind people that you owe it to yourself and to society to be accountable for what you're doing, to not be so dependent upon others, not play the victim card. And that's true here as well, because we're no different than what we are out there in the world. So here's some advice about how to own our accountability. Be personally invested. Learn from both our successes and our failures. That's so important. I'll give you an example later on where people thought, well, we can do no wrong, right? And those failures, well, that's not really failures because we're so on such a high plane of achievement that our failures are really other people's successes, so become arrogant, right? And we don't really pay attention to our failures. Don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to learn from those failures. Likewise, don't be afraid to learn from your successes because there may be things you're still overlooking, right? So we always have to be in that learning mode and ensure our actions are aligned with key results. That's on us. By us, I mean the elders. We're working right now to try to develop a list of results that we think are key to our success here at Skyway Hills for 2019. And we want to make those public and make them plain and communicate them over and over again. Very simple. Here's the results we think we need to focus on right now, right here. And let's do it now and get it done. And so that's on us, really. But it's also on you all to understand what those key results are and to understand and to critically review what we're doing to say, okay, am I working? Am I working in that direction? Are we all moving in the same direction? Is it going to work out? And I've tried to assign scriptures to each of these that back up what I'm saying. All of this stuff sounds great. All these self-help books, they're all the same. They sound wonderful and amazing. And where did you get this information? It turns out it was always there in the Bible in the first place. But it's nicely organized sometimes in these books, and that's where I'm borrowing from, because it's a good way to communicate it. Finally, act on the feedback. We can't be afraid for people to come tell us something. Okay, and that's where I want to focus today, is on that feedback. Not only on the receiving, but especially on the giving of the feedback. If you see one of your peers here doing something, you say, That's not really going right. We're not really getting the results we should. There's lots of ways we could communicate that to them, isn't there? I mean, we could go to them and say, for instance, you're killing us, all right? I can't believe you're messing this up so bad. Look, you're embarrassing. Come on. We could do that, and what do you think they're going to do? Well, you're either going to crush their spirit, or they're going to bow up on you, and there's going to be a fight, right? Or there's another way. Look, here's what's happening. Here's what I observe. And here's the impression I have. What do you think? Do you think this is moving in the right direction? Maybe we should think about something. In other words, approach them as a peer, not as a judge or an executioner. Approach them as one who's side by side, shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow with them in the fight to get the thing done. So I'll talk more about that later. So where I wanted to go today was this. I'll spend most of my time this morning, which hopefully won't be long, Sue. It'll be focused on this particular slide, okay? And I wanted to introduce into our language this concept of above and below the line. And Stephen did a great job of picking that up on very short notice. I really appreciate what he put in the bulletin about that. And it's right on where I wanted to go. I pulled this graph that I put together right out of that Oz principle that I referenced earlier. But I assigned, again, scriptures to it to make it fit to what we do. And it fits very naturally. And let me go into this and explain where it's going. So the concept is the line there, as you see in the middle of the chart. And you have above and below, that's the title. And I wanted to go through some of, first, what's below the line. Because I think we're all very familiar and identify with below the line. I think we all spend time there. And so it'll be easy to understand what I'm talking about. First, ignore and delay. And none of these are in sequence or anything. It's just it all happens in different ways at different times. Ignore and delay. Our eyes are closed to the reality. And I reference Matthew 26 here. This is in the garden where Jesus goes off to pray. And he asks his three closest friends, his closest confidants in his ministry, keep watch and pray. Keep watch and pray. And he comes back and he finds them what? Yeah, they couldn't do it, right? They were bushed. He says, couldn't you even wait for an hour? Come on. And he goes off to pray again. He comes back and he finds them what? Again. Now, maybe it's not fair, but it's an example of what I'm talking about. Ignore and deny. They didn't understand the gravity of where they were at that moment. They didn't understand the seriousness of what Jesus had been telling them, that men were going to come and kill him, take him away. And so they ignored and denied the situation. Another concept is, it's not my job, somebody else's. I avoid ownership. And I reference Matthew 25. This is the parable of the talents. Remember the 1 talent guy? He said, well, I know you're a demanding master. You want products. You want something. You want results. But I was afraid, so I went and I buried your talent. Here it is. What was the response? You wicked and lazy servant. So you knew all these things about me. Why didn't you do something about it? So it's that concept, well, it's not my job, okay? I'm not responsible for what God wants. It's somebody else's job. I'll take care of it. I'll protect it, but I'm not going to do anything with it. It's not my job. Or the wait and see. Avoid the issue. Avoid taking any actions. Genesis 3, right? You may not agree with this one, but this is where Adam and Eve realize, after they've eaten the fruit, after they realize, oh, we've messed up bad, they make clothes for themselves. And they go hide in the bushes. Because why? It's in the cool of the afternoon, and they what? They hear God walking through the garden. You ever wonder what that was like? To hear God walking through? It must have been something pretty dramatic and something pretty bold. Because they heard him. What was their reaction? They hid in the bushes. Well, let's wait and see. Maybe he'll just scoot by and won't notice. Maybe he'll give us a pass on this one. Let's just wait it out and see. Of course, we know where that went. Confusion. We won't engage. We're waiting for somebody to tell us what we should do. And that's where we find ourselves a lot, right? We know that there's problems, but we really can't figure out what's going on, How do we get out of this? And so we're waiting, we're reaching out to other people to come say, Well, look at us. Tell us what's wrong. Tell us what to do. And that's a common thing to do. And in Exodus chapter 32 there, you'll read, if you look at that, you'll read about what the Israelites did while Moses was on the mountain. And he told them, I'm going to be gone, okay? You just watch and pray. And what did they do? They got all confused. They said, this can't be good. We see all this commotion on the mountain, and this guy hasn't come back. We don't know what's happened to him. So, Aaron, why don't you fashion for us some gods of gold? Why don't you do that? So they got all confused. They totally forgot why God brought them out there in the first place. And they were looking for somebody to tell them what to do. So they were looking for this false god to help them, get them out of their situation. Then there's finger pointing and playing the blame game. Oh, we're very familiar with that. And the classic right from the beginning is Adam. She did it. She gave me the apple or the fruit that we weren't supposed to. She did it. It was all her fault. And we're all very familiar with blaming. Finally, we cover our tail. Make sure you can't be held accountable for what's happened. You try to put the blame on somebody else. And in this reference in 2 Samuel, Nathan comes to David and he tells him that parable of the man who stole the poor man's little ewe lamb. And David gets enraged and Nathan says, you're that man, David. You did it. Yeah, you tried to cover it up, but God saw what you did. And now it's time to pay. To David's credit, he took that feedback, he took that criticism, and he did what it took to pay for it. But nonetheless, that's something we all do. We try to cover it up. We try to make sure that, hey, it wasn't my fault, okay? I wasn't involved. We do our best. I'll come back to these verses here that talk about going above the line. But this line that we're talking about is a transition in our behavior between behaving as if everyone else is to blame and playing that victim card, or behaving with integrity and accountability. So I put that little graphic out to the side there that talks about, in below the line behaviors, we're constantly complaining and griping and disputing over things that we can't control in the first place, right? We blame what we can't do. And we live in a state of fear and avoidance. We just avoid the issue. We're afraid to go there. We don't want to mess with it. Just ignore the 600-pound gorilla in the room. Then we'll go on. And we eventually just behave like victims, right? We just don't deal with it. And we say, well, it's not our fault, or it couldn't be helped, or so-and-so did this, and now we're left in this situation. And we find ourselves doing that all the time. Of course, the opposite is where we want to go, but let's be honest. All of us go occasionally below the line. And it's not the end of the world to go below the line, is it? It's not the end of the world to behave like that. It's not irredeemable at all. What's the real danger of going below the line? Exactly. If we stay there, if we just live there all the time, and we constantly use all those excuses and all that blame as a crutch, then we're in trouble. So living below the line will never get us the results that we're after. Living below the line is about avoiding. It's about fear. It's about blame. It's about complaining. It's about not producing results. In fact, giving up on ever producing the results we know we're supposed to do. And it's about accepting less than our best. And that's a bad thing. So I want to give you an example of an organization that experienced a huge public failure. I mean, it was so graphic. There was no escaping it. The analysts that looked at this failure observed that their descent into this type of behavior started years before it became evident. Started years. And it was all about incremental poor judgment. They kept making poor judgment calls about what was happening. And they just refused to change that. They were so convinced of their own good performance, their own infallible nature, that how could they possibly do anything wrong? So they just ignored the warning signs. And their failure didn't happen in one epic moment as it appeared from the outside. It happened over a very long time. Now, sure, they operated in a real complex business, and they had some very, very lofty goals. But the factors that led to their failure were people. were people-oriented. It was at the people level. It wasn't the big projects they were working on or the big organization. It was about the individuals. The individuals believed that culture, and they said, well, we're so-and-so, so we don't really make mistakes. And so these little failures that we're observing, we can live with those. We can accept those because we're that good. We can work around it, and we can make it all work, and it won't be a problem. And all of this kept going, kept snowballing, and to where they lowered their standards. They no longer had this standard where they said, we won't go below this line. They just kept lowering that line down and down and down. And they said, this is okay. Okay, now this is okay. Year after year, they kept lowering the standards. They got to a point where finally it was all over. So who am I talking about? Am I talking about like an Enron? You all know that story. Or WorldCom? That one's close by. Am I talking about the big banks that failed in 2008 and 2009? Or the big industries that were bailed out? Anybody know what that picture is? Challenger, 1986, January of 1986. No denying that failure, was there? This was a huge public event. We're sending the very first civilian into space. A school teacher, Christy McAuliffe, was going there to be an ambassador, right, for NASA, to the public. And then this happened. Turned out the damage to and we've studied this over and over again at work, especially in a technical world, you study this and all the failures that happen. So, and you've probably seen NOVA presentations or other, Discovery Channel things on it, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But the real source of the problem was technically the O-rings on the SRMs, the solid rocket motors or boosters, those big rockets that were mounted to the side of the shuttle. Those O-rings had a failure point. Certain temperature, they really weren't good for the application they were being used in. And people warned them about that. People said, look, this test data shows this thing really, we shouldn't be launching below this temperature. We shouldn't do it. And in fact, on the day of that launch, it was cold there at Cape Kennedy. And one of the engineers said, don't do it. My calculations showed this could be a real problem. Hey, we're NASA. We went to the moon, right, and back. We saved those guys on Apollo 13. We could do anything. We're gods, after all. What do you mean we can't launch? Oh, no, we're launching. And you see what happened. Ernest Hemingway wrote about this in one of his books, The Sun Also Rises. He wrote there that organizations and people fail differently than you think. First gradually, and then suddenly. It goes on and on for a long time, just gradually, just incremental failures, and then suddenly it becomes apparent. So it might start with a reasonable excuse. Well, this is not going right. We're not doing this in our church. Well, that's because X, right? It starts with that. And then it just keeps escalating. And maybe it gets to a point where we're blaming each other. Or maybe it becomes that's just the way it is kind of thing, where we give up and we just say, well, that's just how it is here. This is the way we'll operate from now on. Is that really where any of us want to live, though? I don't think so. So let me go back here and talk about above the line, where we really want to go. We want to start by seeing the problems, all right? We have to be willing to take an honest look at ourselves and recognize how we might actually be the problem. We may have already met the problem, and the problem is us. And thus, we have to make some changes in our attitudes and our behaviors. And so, if you look there in your Bibles, I want you to look at those references there for above the line. And let's start with see the problems. Eyes wide open, recognize. Revelation chapter 3. Jesus is talking to the churches. And here he's talking to Sardis. He says, I know you. You have a reputation of being alive, but I know you're dead inside. You left your first love. Go back. Go back to the beginning. Repent. See what's going wrong with yourselves. Don't rely on what other people are saying about you from the outside. Oh, it's wonderful. Oh, it's good. Don't rely on that. Go into this situation with eyes wide open and see the real truth. Know it and do something about it. See, this is probably the most difficult hurdle for us to get over, is that self-critical look with eyes wide open to see that we might be actually part of the problem. And I mean that as an organization, as a church, but also as individuals who are working together with our peers. We might actually be the problem. If we're working with somebody and it just seems to be going rough and we're not getting where we need to go, first place to go, mirror. First place. Before you go anywhere else, there and in prayer to God. Second, own the problem, like we said here in Galatians 6:4. Read that. We have to accept the realities we create for the church and be responsible for how they impact us and others around us. And it's on that foundation that we can begin to build the relationships that we need to get to where we want to be. If we own the problem ourselves, if we're not constantly saying, whoop, I didn't do it. Those guys did it. No, step up and own it. Even if you weren't part of it, you're still part of it because you're part of this family of Christ. If something's wrong, you own it. Next, seek the solutions, regardless of who gets the credit. There's a great quote out there from Harry Truman. He says, it's amazing what people can do if nobody's concerned about who gets the credit. That's the way it ought to be here, right? That's the way it ought to be. And so look there at 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Read those verses while I talk, would you? Beginning in verse 12. It's an amazing dialogue by Paul. He had a lot of problems with the Corinthian church that he had established, with people coming in behind him and saying, look, Paul's not that great a guy, okay? When he's here, he doesn't speak all that well. And really, is he really the authority that he should be? And Paul goes through an amazing dialogue to describe this concept of the only one that deserves the credit is God. None of us. I don't take credit for anything I didn't do, and you shouldn't listen to people trying to take credit for things I've already done. Don't go there. And so we have to seek solutions with that sense of humility, not worried about who gets the credit, because who really deserves all the credit? God. That's the only one we're working for, right? So if we're all pulling in that direction, it won't matter who's doing what, because it's God that gets the glory. And finally, execute. Colossians 3:23 tells us, work as if you're working for the Lord. And so, follow through with some determination and courage to implement the solution that we come up with. You know, this is that kind of, that JFK inaugural speech moment, right? Where he said, ask not what your country can do for you, right? But ask what you can do instead for your church. I digress. But you get the concept. So, let me go back. Where are we below the line? Having discussed all that, where do we most often go below the line? What part? Going back to those questions I asked at the beginning, what part of us takes us below the line more often than not? And it's all about our tongue, isn't it? As James chapter 3 describes, especially there in verses 6 and 8, it tells us we absolutely need a Savior because we can't tame our tongues. We're powerless in that regard to keep absolute control on ourselves. We need His help to do that. And that's what James is trying to stress. He's not playing the victim card. He's not saying there's nothing you can do about it. He's saying just the opposite. You yourselves under your own power can't do anything about it. You need Jesus to make that happen. So rather than just accept that corrupt nature of our tongue and unwholesome speech, as Lewis read earlier for us from Ephesians 4, we can reach out to Jesus for help, reminding us to think about what we're going to say before we say it, especially to one another, as it regards the works that we're doing. Ask yourselves, does what I'm about to say, does that help move the church closer to where we want to go? Does that help get the results? Or does it just make me feel better to get it off my chest? A lot of us, we admire that, right? Somebody who speak their mind and throw it out there. Is that really the best way? Not always. Not always. Sometimes there's a place for that, but not always. More often than not, it's not the way. We're all part of the same body, and what we say, what we do, that all has an effect on others. So let me give you a worldly example of what I'm talking about here, about speech. All right, I want to use 2 basketball coaches. Now, I don't know that much about basketball. I played it and watched it some, but I'm sure all of you know much more than I do. And so please excuse me, these examples are probably somewhat dated, but they get the point across, right? Bobby Knight, everyone knows him, and Coach John Wooden. I hope you know him, right? 2 extremely successful NCAA coaches, right? But 2 extremely diverse examples of this behavior above and below the line. Guess where Bobby lived all of his career? Way down there below it, right? It was not uncommon for him, and he did it. In fact, you can Google it and see it. Just to get so mad, he got up and threw a chair across the court in the middle of the game, right? Or choke out one of his players. He was all about fear and intimidation. And to him, the only thing that mattered were results. And the university stuck with him. I guess that's all that mattered to them, too. So the character and the nature of his behavior didn't matter so much as the result. Now, he got good results. His win-loss record, 902, 371. Pretty good. Hard to argue, right? So he makes his case. Hey, I don't care what my critics say. I got results. John Wooden, very soft-spoken, very warm, very friendly, very humble. And to him, it wasn't about so much teaching basketball. He did that and did it well at UCLA. He taught young boys to become young men. And they stayed with him. They were lifelong students. Long after they went to the NBA, long after they retired, they kept coming back to John Wooden because he was that kind of teacher. He was a life teacher. That's what he focused on. And so his win-loss record, 664 over 162. The numbers aren't quite the same, are they? But if you look at the real results, where the schools want to go to playoffs, Bobby Knight, 3 Division Is, 5 Final Fours. John Wooden, 10 Division Is, 12 Final Fours. So tell me, who had the more successful career? John Wooden knew something about this long before this was a thing, this concept of living above and below the line. So I want to share with you some of the quotes you can read. If you want to do yourself a favor, you want to read a book about a real-life person that maybe is inspiring and maybe lifts you up a little bit, find one about John Wooden. You'll be impressed. Here's some quotes. Things turn out best for the people who make the best of the way things turn out. Do not let what you cannot do interfere with what you can do. That's exactly what I was talking about. Above the line, we're focused on what we can do. Don't worry about all that other stuff. Be concerned with your character, more with your character than with your reputation. Your character is what you really are, while your reputation is merely what others think you are. Make each day your masterpiece. This guy's a gold mine. You really should read more about him. Talent is God-given. Be humble. Fame is man-given. Be grateful. Conceit is self-given. Be careful. Success is peace of mind, which is a direct result of self-satisfaction and knowing you did your best to become the best you're capable of becoming. These are things he taught his students regularly. I mean, this is what his approach was to basketball, but more importantly, to life. It's what you learn after you know it all that counts. I like that one. It's the little details that are vital. Little things make big things happen. Oh, isn't that true? It's about the day-to-day stuff, right? It's not about the big epic moments. Those happen because of the day-to-day stuff. True? Never mistake activity for achievement. Let me show you something. Go back to our chart. You know what happens when results don't turn out like we want them? In most organizations, including this one, where does the quote-unquote management usually go? We go right down there. Let me go back one more line. We go there. See that third bullet down? We never go back any further than actions. We see the results, they're not what we wanted, they're not what we hoped for, and so we take some more actions. We come up with a new process. We come up with a new this. We write a memo for that or something like that. And so we go right to actions. When we skip going back to experiences. And we forget that all we're doing is we're trapped below the line. It's that action trap where we think, oh, we need a new action. We forgot to do this. Oh, we need to do that. We forgot to do that. Right? Never mistake activity for achievement. Failure is not fatal, but failure to change might be. Oh, I like that one. So, John understood the concept of living above or below the line. So I want to close this morning. I think this is important to us because I want to introduce this into our language, as I said before, as a common theme for all of us, so that we can know what we're talking about when we communicate with each other and we say, you know, it sounds like we're going below the line now. We'll all know, okay, I know. It's a good way for us to reference, okay, I understand what you're saying. I need to be more accountable. I need to have more integrity. I need to play less of the victim, less of the blame game, less of the hopeless, oh, woe is me routine, and instead do something about it. So I want to close here with Colossians 3, verses 1 through 4. We have to ask ourselves that JFK type question, as I mentioned. You know, are we waiting for the church, for what the church can do for us? Or are we actively seeking what we can do for the church and even more for the Lord? There's a way to change our experiences, as I just referenced there, so that we change our true beliefs and take the actions that lead to productive results for Jesus' church. But it takes a conscious effort on all of our part. We all have to be mindful, understand where we're trying to go and how we need to get there. And these are the principles that we need to apply. So let me close with these questions. Where do you want to live? Above or below? Which will you be happy with? Being accountable to God or just being a victim of this world's circumstances? Like that lazy and worthless servant in Matthew 25. Finally, whom will you serve with your life? You or the Lord? So the lesson is yours. I hope it helps to clarify where we're trying to go with accountability in this church and how we're trying to set ourselves up for greater success in 2019 or even sooner if possible. But if I've said anything to spark something in your heart or in your mind and you want to know more about what I'm talking about this relationship with Jesus, about putting Him on in baptism, about counting the cost and saying, yes, Lord, I'm willing to sacrifice these things. It's so much less than what you sacrificed, what we celebrated at the table. Yes, Lord, that's what I want. I want to follow you. If you want to know more about how to do that, I hope you'll let me know after we stand and sing.